Hi, this is Anita from the Dusty Roads podcast and from the blog A Bus on a Dusty Road. And those of you that might have been following me, we're all about living life as a global citizen. And since we're about living life as a global citizen, today I want to talk a little bit about Tibetan Buddhism versus Zen Buddhism, and specifically 7 of their main differences. I have been to Tibet, and Tibet is a magical place to visit. I actually went into the part of Tibet, which is right between Tibet and China. It's a place that very few foreigners go. We went up there on some charity projects, and literally it was 18 hours on mountain roads in the middle of nowhere. So I've been to some Tibetan temples that literally are out in the middle of nowhere. So I've always wondered a little bit about what's the difference between Zen Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is basically, it's a minimalist Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism is more of an elaborate Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is about minimalism or being a minimalist. The pendant of Zen Buddhism is to live a simple life or minimalist life. That is what really influences Zen Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism is much more elaborate form of Buddhism. When you go to Tibet, one thing that I was surprised about was how elaborate some of these temples were, and they can actually be quite elaborate. Zen Buddhism originates from Japan, and Tibetan Buddhism from Tibet. And Zen Buddhism is sort of a mixture of the Indian Mahayana Buddhism and Taoism. And Zen Buddhism, it actually really began in China, but then spread to Korea and Japan. But it's really known, the name Zen comes from Japan, and the whole minimalist is more from Japan. As Zen's a Japanese word, most people think of Zen Buddhism and think of Japan. And so the word Zen can be translated to mean absorption or meditative state. So like most things in Asia, originally comes from China, but at the same time, the word Zen comes from Japan. Tibetan Buddhism is a much older form of Buddhism that started in the 6th to 9th century, and it came from India to Tibet. Tibetan Buddhism is better known in the West than Zen is. And this is very interesting because, a lot of Westerners know Tibetan Buddhism because, essentially they think about the Dalai Lama, and so they think about Tibetan Buddhism. And also many people in the West may not understand that also Mongolia practices Tibetan Buddhism. So besides Tibet, where they're practiced mainly Tibetan Buddhism, also Mongolia does too. There's many Tibetan temples also in the United States and Europe. And this is, due in part to the popularity of Tibetan Buddhism and the leader Dalai Lama. Zen Buddhism does not have the same recognition as Tibetan Buddhism does. Most people in the West have heard of Zen, but they may not necessarily equate it to Zen Buddhism. But yet worldwide, there are more Zen Buddhists than Tibetan Buddhists. And this is because a lot of people in Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and even China will practice a form of Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism accounts for 20% of all Buddhist temples in Japan. So on the other hand, Tibetan Buddhism is in places as Tibet and Mongolia, some parts of Nepal and small parts of India, Siberia, Far East Russia, and Northeast China. It's also the state religion of Bhutan. And population-wise, the Tibetan Buddhism practicing countries are far less densely populated than Korea, Japan, China, or Vietnam. So this is one reason why Tibetan Buddhism there's not as many people in the world practicing it as Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, they both emphasize different things. Zen Buddhism emphasizes a rigorous self-restraint, meditation practice, and looks into the nature and the mind of things. It looks into the personal experience, into the insights into daily life, especially into the benefit for others. It focuses on clearing your mind through meditation. So the major aim of Zen Buddhism is to discover the inner hidden, light that is within every single person. Whereas Tibetan Buddhism believes in supernatural beings are very prominent in Tibetan Buddhism. So someone that's looking from the outside in Tibetan Buddhism may feel that Tibetan Buddhism is almost primitive, but it's actually very deep with very logical philosophies on life, death, rebirth, and existence. It's a spiritual development, and its aim is to receive a Buddhahood or an enlightenment for oneself and to help others achieve the same. Zen meditation or Buddhism, it emphasizes the breath. It ends, emptying your mind while following your breath. So at the core of Zen Buddhism is completely vacate, or to completely empty your mind and to have a state of nothingness so that you can purge yourself of all desires, ambitions, and emotions. Whereas Tibetan Buddhism uses mantras and visualizations. And mantras can be a short prayer that are thought to, help alter one's mind and help connect with a particular Buddha or enlightened being. And that's why, sometimes you might hear like some of the mantras, they might be saying prayers out loud and repeating. Tibetan Buddhism is actually more religious than Zen. It's thought to be a more religious form of Buddhism. That's because Tibetan Buddhism has supernatural beings, Buddhas and other gods and spirits. And it has some very complex rituals and prayers. But Zen Buddhism also has some rituals, but they're minimalist forms of rituals. And Zen Buddhism is generally less complicated and less formal than Tibetan Buddhism. So even though Zen and Tibetan Buddhism are different kinds of Buddhism, one is not necessarily better than the other. They're both authentic forms of Buddhism. And, Buddhism, like so many other things in our life, are really personal choices. And in many cases, the form of Buddhism that a person might practice may really be linked to where they're born. For example, if someone's born in Tibet, there's almost like a 99% chance that they will be practicing Tibetan Buddhist. For many people that are born in a place like Mongolia, which actively practices Tibetan Buddhism. On the other hand, someone who's born in Japan or Korea might have more of a Zen attitude towards Buddhism and their Buddhism practice. So this is kind of, a great example of how, culture can really, have a difference on Buddhism. And I believe that this is something like, especially if you're going to travel to any of these countries, is to sort of understand the difference, to understand that, in one place, the Zen Buddhism may not be the same as the Tibetan. So you don't want to go to Japan and ask somebody, do you believe in the Dalai Lama? They might look at you like, the Dalai who? So I think it is important that people who are traveling and are or just people who want to be good global citizens, that they understand the religions of different people in the world, because religion is such an important part of most people's lives and their identity. And it's important that you understand them so that you can respect their religions and respect their identities and respect who they are. I am personally a great believer in this kind of respect, that we as individuals and as human beings need to show respect for everybody around the world, no matter what religion they are, that we need to respect them and their religious beliefs. This is Anita from a Bus on a Dusty Road blog or the Dusty Roads podcast. This is all about living life as a global citizen, and part of living life as a global citizen is accepting people and their religions and their own personal beliefs. We hope that you have enjoyed this podcast. If you have, give us a thumbs up. We'd love to have you rate and review us. And if you have any questions, please let us know. Thank you so much for listening. This podcast is sponsored by A Bus on a Dusty Road, a blog about living life as a global citizen. Please go to our blog at abusonadastyroad.com and sign up for our free newsletter. If you've enjoyed this podcast, give us a thumbs up, leave us a review, and help to pass this along. Thank you so much for listening.